Okay, well, here we are. Welcome to our part 3 of Leviticus chapter 4. We're going to look at the ha'atat again, and we're going to include the red heifer purification offering. The ha'atat offering, if we'll start with our notes, introduces a new category of offering that addresses behavioral sin. We talked about it before, but we need to make sure that we're still staying on task. Behavioral sin is not intentional, but it is done accidentally or by mistake, which means that you did a behavior, but the main thing is it was not intentional, it was by mistake, or you did it accidentally. Chapter 4 lists the offenders and their required offerings according to the rank and value. The rank is really talking about the position of, for example, the high priest, and the amount of damage that the high priest can incur upon the whole body of Messiah if he accidentally sins and creates a problem, because if God is offended at him, then the whole congregation will suffer the consequences. So when we're talking about rank, it's really dealing with the issue of how much trouble does that person, or for example the nation, if they should sin accidentally in doing something they're not supposed to, and we're talking about the majority of the nation, then the whole nation would suffer for it. And it goes down in responsibility all the way down to the individual. The individual can create some problems, but not nearly the depth of problems and the kind of problems that the high priest could incur upon the whole nation. So we're talking about rank in that regard, and the value. What God was really trying to do with the value was, for the high priest, for example, he had a lot of responsibility. And if he didn't pay attention to what he was doing, it was a very serious matter. So God made it so that the most expensive offering had to be made by the high priest. And if the high priest made a mistake this week and it cost him a bull, a 3-year-old mature bull, and then he made another mistake next week, it could get extremely expensive. It'd be like giving a brand new car once a week or more often to appease the issue. So the high priest, being the most important person, he required the most valuable sacrifice. And number 1 in our notes, of course, that is referring to the 3-year-old mature bull, which was paid for the purification of the temple. And I want to make and emphasize that point. It did not purify the person. It purified the temple. The person, their relationship with God was, as we talked about in the first 3 sacrifices that we looked at, that was dealt with very specifically through those sacrifices, the Olah, the Minha, and the Zavav. But as far as the purification of the temple went, we have to realize that whenever sin was involved, and especially if you were anybody in the temple or within the holy community, it had an effect. And so we're really talking about the purification of the temple, not the person with the ha'atat offering. So the sheminka, the procedure, pretty much followed the procedure that we're familiar with. We had the sheminka, the laying out of hands, which transferred the guilt of the high priest to the bull. The blood was then sprinkled on the veil and placed on the horns of the incense altar. We talked about this last week, so we can go through this relatively quickly. The ha'atat offering expiates the mistake's corruption of the holy temple. And that again is, we need to be reminded and remember that we're talking about anything that brought any kind of defilement into the holy temple, the place where God was going to be residing. Every sin, that's why we dealt with the unintentional sins that were basically from the sin nature of man. And now we're dealing with behavioral sins that are mistakes, if you will, but still had to be dealt with. So the Hatat offering expiates the mistake's corruption. And what it does, it removes completely the sin's guilt, if you will, completely out of and purifies again the holy temple. Now, C, the carcass was destroyed outside the camp, and it was considered unclean and contaminated. What we have to see here is that the corrupting poison of the high priest's behavior is absorbed by the bull and then destroyed. We talked last time about sin as being a poison that permeates people, but it also can permeate by its functioning and corruption. It can spread, if you will, throughout the whole temple involvement, at least in regards to how God views it. And so he wants it out of there and destroyed. And so when we look at this, we realize that the poison is actually absorbed by the bull, and that really, it's almost like a sponge that would draw up all of the sin into one place, and then that bull really needed to be taken out and destroyed, because it would be carrying the guilt through the Shemitah, the laying on of hands, and it was intended to be that which would remove and carry away that guilt and the sin from out of the camp. We have a very similar thing with Yom Kippur, with the two goats, in which the high priest for the nation chooses one of the goats for Adonai and one for Azazel. He lays hands on the one that is for Azazel, and it carries the guilt of the nation away from the temple and out into the wilderness, where it is basically going to be destroyed. Now, biblically, there is no mandate to push the goat off of any cliff. That is just people came up with that and added that in. But God just wanted it removed. Going out into the wilderness, the idea that the wilderness was the area of corruption. And we could talk about that for a while, but tonight we really won't. I want to get through this. So we have this listing of offenders, and high priest being the most important. The nation, B in our notes, was next in importance, and it required a sacrifice that just a slightly less value. Again, we have another bull involved, but it's a 1-year-old bull, and it paid for the purification of the temple, not the nation. It was offered by the nation, but it was about the temple. The procedure followed the same pattern, with the poisoned carcass being destroyed. And so there isn't much difference between the procedure. It's just the fact that it was a slightly less valued animal that was used. Then we come to the tribal leaders, which they followed with a male goat replacing the bull. The value again was lower for a tribal leader than it was for the nation, and certainly for the high priest. The procedure changed as well. The procedure became a zavav, a peace offering protocol that was incorporated, and there was a fellowship shared meal involved. The priest that did the offering got to eat of the offering. And also, it wasn't the high priest that had to perform these rituals at this point. It was a common priest that sprinkled the blood outside the temple. So it wasn't inside on the parakeet, on the veil between the holy place and the Holy of Holies. It was sprinkled outside the temple, and it was applied to the brazen altar horns as opposed to the incense altar horns. And so we see that there is less of a concern as to how invasive the tribal leaders' influence would be over the whole nation. Now, then, of course, we come to the common priest sprinkled blood, and that was sprinkled outside the temple and applied. Okay, wait a minute. Wait. Yeah, okay, we already did that part. I'm forgetting. We didn't come to the common priesthood offering. We came to the individual's hatat offering, and that was to be a female sheep or a goat, which is, again, of a lower value than a male. And again, the Zabav protocol is followed as just as the tribal leader protocol was followed. So again, you got to share in some of the food, the meat that was left. And so we have these 4 protocols, and I mean, they pretty much run through the whole chapter, the whole 4th chapter. And so with that, there's not a lot of difference. We can read, and you should, I hope you have read chapter 4, but you can see all of these things being done. Chapter 4 actually ends with these words. It says, "Thus shall the priest make kippur, atonement for him in regard to the sin he has committed, and he will be forgiven." This is a very important thing to see, because for the most part, Christianity doesn't believe that these offerings really provided real forgiveness. But indeed they did. This was a real time of forgiveness. The thing we have to always keep in mind, of course, this is not for intentional sins that you did on purpose, sins that God considers to be blasphemy against him. But these were all unintentional sins coming from, if you will, our sin nature, and coming from mistakes that we have made. That's where we are right now. We have not finished all of these offerings, but none of them so far has been anything to do with intentional sin. But they did expiate and did provide real forgiveness for the sin nature, and they did provide forgiveness for anything that we had done unintentionally by accident that would have transgressed God's holiness. So, number 1 there, of course, the substitute offering provided real forgiveness for unintentional behavioral sin. Hebrews 13, when we read Hebrews 13, I'd like to read it because it takes us right to the understanding of the ha'atat. Oh, I'm going to have to go get my notes. They just flew away. I shall return. I can pretty much reach them from here. That's good. I don't know if it's hot on the mountain, but it's hot down the hill. So I got the fan going, and my notes decided to fly away. Almost reminds me of that old song, "One Glad Morning We'll All Fly Away," if you remember that one. And in Hebrews chapter 13. Glory. Oh my. Some of you are older and really remember that song, huh? All right, very good. So chapter 13 of Hebrews, in verse 10, it says, "We have an altar from which those who serve the tabernacle have no right to eat." Now, if you know about our offerings and what we talked about, when we talk about an altar in which people have no right to eat, your ears start picking up and going, okay, what else is there going to be revealed? "For the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy place by the high priest as an offering for sin are burned outside the camp. Now, see, when you read that, if you've been part of what we've been studying, you know right away we're talking about a ha'atat offering. And therefore, Yeshua also, that he might sanctify the people through his own blood, suffered outside the camp. So let us go out to him outside the camp, bearing his reproach. For here we do not have a lasting city, but we are seeking the city which is to come. Now, when you read verses such as that, right away you can begin to identify what kind of a sacrifice that Yeshua was involved in. And so when you begin to see that, you can really take hold and realize exactly what Yeshua has accomplished through his giving of himself. And that's why we're looking at this as much as we are. I really want us to take hold of that kind of understanding. So number two are the Hebrew 13:10 through 13, where it says, let us go outside the gate. As soon as you hear outside the gate, you realize that we're talking about a offering that was to be destroyed, and an offering that was unclean, and all of that. And so we kind of need to pay attention and realize, what did God do with Yeshua? He placed the sins of the world upon him. He became extremely unclean. And in that case, he needed to be destroyed. And he died out there. And so, we look at those things and it's like, okay, I don't like that, but it really helps me to understand some things perhaps we haven't really regarded and taken to its full conclusion. But as we go on, I think we'll see even more things. We're talking about number two, the Hatat red heifer purification offering of Numbers, chapter 19. Now, chapter 19 of Numbers, let me turn over there if I can. It begins. It said, the Lord spoke to Moshe and Aaron, saying, this is the statute of the law which the Lord has commanded, saying, speak to the sons of Israel, that they bring you an unblemished red heifer, in which is no defect, and on which a yoke has never been placed. You shall give it to Eleazar the priest, and it shall be brought outside the camp and be slaughtered in his presence. Next, Eleazar the priest shall take some of its blood with his finger and sprinkle some of its blood toward the front of the tent of meeting 7 times. Then the heifer shall be burned in his sight, its hide and its flesh, and its blood and its refuse shall be burnt. The priest shall take cedar wood and hyssop, or oregano, and scarlet material, and cast it into the midst of the burning heifer. The priest shall then wash his clothes and bathe his body in water, and afterward come into the camp. But the priest shall be unclean until evening. The one who burns it shall also wash his clothes in water and bathe his body in water, and shall be unclean until evening. Well, it's a pretty interesting introduction here. We have the red heifer revealed to us in our notes. The purpose of the ritual is really to decontaminate. Anyone who has had connection with a corpse. And I could say with anything dead. So the purpose of this ritual procedure is absolutely to decontaminate a person who's become unclean to coming in contact with a dead body. The thing we always have to keep in mind, that God is a creator God and he has created life. Everything he's given life to is to reproduce. He's not the author and finisher of death. That was never his intention. His intention was to create life, to fill the world with those that would fellowship with him, those that would love him and serve him in the way that was pleasing to him, and he could be pleasing to them. So whenever death is involved, it really is an affront to God, because God is a holy God, and his holiness is really all about giving life. Even when he has spoken, we understand the concept that his words go out from his mouth and they go on and on and on and on. And the farther they go, the more they create. We talk about the universe, and can we find the edge of the universe? Well, we can't, because by the time we find where it is now, it has moved. It's ever expanding. And so when we look at that kind of stuff and realize God is all about life, and so any kind of death is an affront to him. So the ultimate purpose is to prevent defilement of the sanctuary of the Lord. See, this specific type of impurity, if you will, is the very thing. It's the same as uncleanliness, and God is always about removing that from us in every way possible. So we keep in mind that the holiness that resides within us, and this is something we have to keep in mind, the ultimate purpose to prevent defilement of the sanctuary, we have to keep in mind that the holiness that resides within us can likewise be defiled, and that we should do our best to protect ourselves from contamination by unclean people, spirits, and things. We talked before, and I don't know if it's Torah study or where, about removing idols from our home. It came up just on Torah study, I think. Yeah, actually this week, somebody asked about dream catchers. Well, dream catchers, you need to get rid of those things. Lilith is the goddess of nighttime and dreams. She can give you all kinds of dreams that you really don't want. So dream catchers and anything like that, any kind of idol, you really need to remove from your home as quickly and as clearly as possible. So what we're going to discover here is we're going to see, let's see, I got a little thing here. I'm going to have to move that and get rid of that. I don't know if you guys see what I see, but I don't like things interrupting me. And supposedly, nothing is supposed to interrupt me. I've got all this stuff supposed to say, stay away, don't interrupt, but it doesn't seem to obey the commands I've given it.
Pastor Paul.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know what that interruption is, but Trina called me. She's having trouble getting on, so she may get in there somehow. I don't know.
Okay. Well, I don't know where. Here. Let me go to participants. Okay. I have no idea. She doesn't show up on the screen.
No, she just called me. She's having trouble. All right.
Okay. Well,
we can't do anything tonight.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Yep. I'm not sure what she's having trouble with. Can you guys still see the screen all right with just the notes on it? Yeah, okay, here, let me.
Can.
Yeah, is anything else on the screen other than the notes, Dorothy?
No, just
okay. All right, good. And
all
shut
right.
yourself off so we can have quiet and we can go on, I hope. Okay. I'm going to have to, let's see. Okay. Some of this stuff, you know, I get stuff that comes along and, you know, I try to move it and it doesn't want to cooperate with me. Okay, there we go. Okay. Sorry about that. I don't like interruptions, but when things happen, and I don't know. I'm not always the quickest guy to figure out what to do. So where were we? Oh, in our notes, the Hatat red offer, purification offering. The purpose is to decontaminate. The ultimate purpose is to prevent defilement of the sanctuary. The required, number 2 in our notes, the required supply of a red heifer and the Ha'atat procedure outside the camp. Now, we got the requirements of the heifer in verses 1 and 2, where Adonai said to Moshe and Aaron, said, this is a regulation from the Torah, which Adonai has commanded. Tell the people of Israel to bring you a young red female cow, a heifer, without fault or defect, and which has never borne a yoke. And, you know, that's where we find out what our purpose is. So we realize all of those things. This animal was very specifically to be a heifer, a red heifer. It was to be young, but no younger than a year. It was to have never been yoked, which means never have been used for common work. And as all animals in ritual sacrifice, the animal must be unblemished. And the priest must take the red heifer outside the camp to the place where it's going to be killed. The red heifer was escorted out of the camp to an unclean place where a makeshift altar of common firewood was erected, and that's where the sacrifice was actually made. So we find out that we have the requirements of the heifer. Then we have the 5-step protocol that prevents the process of karet, of being cut off. And the person, this is what in verse 19:20, this is where we get the idea of what needs to be transpiring. It says, the person who remains unclean and does not purify himself will be cut off from the community because he has defiled the sanctuary of Adonai. The water for purification has not been sprinkled on him, and he remains unclean. So this whole process, this reveals to us really the bottom line of what is going on. It says, because he has defiled the sanctuary of Adonai. The cleaning process from corpse or death defilement was such an important thing that in actuality, if you didn't deal with it, you would be cut off. And to be cut off simply meant that your life was forfeited. You would lose your position within the community of Israel, and also you would lose your relationship with Yahweh. And so it's a very serious thing. So the ashes of the red heifer, while the temple was standing, was an absolute necessity, which if we understand that, then we can see why even today that the Jewish community is so anxious to find a red heifer that fits the criteria. They do want to build the sanctuary. They do want to have the temple rebuilt, but they also know that all these years that they have not been able to purify the temple and to alleviate their own sin and their defilement. So they're very anxious to have the red heifer so they can actually accomplish that. So the 5 steps are here. Number 1, the high-ranking priest, not a high priest, but a senior level priest, escorts the red cow, the heifer, to a common wood pile, cuts the throat of the cow, and gathers the dripping blood into a ceremonial vessel. Step 2, the priest then turns around and with his finger sprinkles blood 7 times in the direction of the sanctuary door. Now, one thing I want to remind us of, whenever we see or read the words before Adonai, it always is going to be indicating to the east, because the sanctuary faced to the east and the door was open toward the east. And so whenever the offering was going to be made outside that had anything to do with the temple, it always had to be to the east. And Mount of Olives is to the east of the sanctuary location. And so it was there that they had established an altar, that is where they would burn all of the things that needed to be burned that were considered actually temeh, unclean, and so on and so forth. So what the priest would do, he'd take the blood, he'd turn back toward the sanctuary, and he would sprinkle the blood 7 times toward the sanctuary. Now, he was a long ways away, so don't think that it actually reached the sanctuary. It was outside of the holy limits of the set apart city of Jerusalem, if you will. So, step 3, the whole cow, as in every part of it, was completely burned up on the now raging bonfire. While the cow was being burnt, the priest would throw in cedar wood, hyssop, and a red thread into the mix. The 4th step, following the burning, was the bathing. The priest removed his ritual garments and bathed in water. And it was there, if there was an assistant with him, he too bathed and changed it into a new set of clothing. And understand that the priest was not allowed to return to the camp until the sun set. And even after returning to camp, he and his assistant, if there were one, would be ritually unclean until sundown. Again, this indicates the end of the current day and the beginning of the next. Step 5, a man who had up to this point in time not participated in the ritual and thus was still ritually clean, if he came in contact with the ashes and put them in a specially, well, he did come, he actually came to collect them actually. He collected the ashes and put them in a specially contained spot where the pile of the red heifer ashes would be combined with water, which resulted in the mixture that would be used to purify anybody who'd come in contact with a corpse. Well, since the man who had just gathered up the ashes, when he came, was clean, was pure, because of his contact with the ashes, he also became unclean and therefore had to take a bath in Mayim Hayim and would be in an unclean state until the sun set. So what we have here is a paradox that pretty much goes, whoever touches the purification offering becomes defiled, but whoever is touched by the purification offering is cleansed. In other words, if I'm the priest and I take it and I use it to touch you, I become unclean, but you become clean. And so it's really a paradox that when you look at it and you think, okay, what's this all about? Well, the rabbis, the priests, they had a very hard time explaining what this process was about. They basically came to the conclusion that God had said to do it, and so we will do it. That's what it was about. It didn't matter. You could come up with all kinds of ideas about it, but nobody really was able to identify this process until much later in the life of the nation of Israel. So, verse 20 again, we read this more than once here. It says, a person who remains unclean and does not purify himself will be cut off from the community because he has defiled the sanctuary of Adonai. The water for purification has not been sprinkled on him, and he is unclean. Now, this is the key to the hot purification offering. It's the key here, and it's also the key when we're not dealing with the red heifer. It really is all about protecting the sanctuary from contamination. So verse 19 or 21, excuse me, chapter 19, 21 and 22 read, "This is to be a permanent regulation for them. The person who sprinkles the water for purification is to wash his clothes. Whoever touches the water for purification will be unclean until evening. Anything the unclean person touches will be unclean, and anyone who touches him will be unclean until evening." Well, the clean person who sprinkles the ash and water mixture onto the person who's been defiled by a corpse himself becomes unclean. I think we're getting that idea, but it doesn't hurt to make sure that we really drive the point in. He must also, of course, wash his clothes, take a bath, and remain unclean until evening. Now, we've all learned previously, and previously not just in this study, but even before this, we've learned that holiness is contagious and can be transmitted from one person to another, from an object to a person, and vice versa, and from object to object. Let me move our notes up here a little bit. We've also learned that if a person or thing contacts holiness when he shouldn't, when he's not qualified, that person or object will then be destroyed. That's exactly what happened to Aaron's sons. They were not authorized to be doing what they were doing. The purification qualifications were not there, and it cost them their lives. Now, one thing we need to notice here, if you did, that anybody who was involved with the red heifer ritual at any level was rendered unclean. It's a purification process, as is every ha'atat sacrifice, meaning that just as everyone involved with the red heifer ritual becomes defiled with the destruction of the red heifer carcass, so did everyone with the burning destruction of the ha'atat purification carcass. In other words, whenever the high priest made a mistake and had to make an offering in which the bull was utilized, whoever did the work of taking the bull out and burning it, those people remained unclean and became unclean until evening. The very same ashes of the red heifer made the clean unclean. Interestingly enough, as we've said more than once so far, made the unclean clean. Now, this is a complete reversal from what we've seen with all the other sacrifices. All the other sacrifices atone for, and in a majority of the cases, make one clean or at least confer a degree of holiness onto the participants. Now, this is a tough thing to realize. How do we deal with it, and what are we going to see? I think you already probably, if you're thinking ahead, you've already figured out that this has a great deal to do with the temple. Yeshua, in his sacrifice, in following the pattern for purifying the office of high priest, we understand that he was going to take the office of high priest, and he was actually providing for the cleansing of the high priesthood so that they could fulfill the requirements of unleavened bread and Shavuot and all of those things that were going to come up in the coming year. But he also provided the avenue whereby the temple was going to be able to be purified and cleansed and prepared for the coming of the Holy Spirit, if you will. So we'll look at that just here shortly. Now, this is an important point. The Hebrew word kadosh, whether it's kadesh or kadosh, we need to understand it does not mean holy. It means set apart. The context defines the purpose. In other words, think of it this way. If you're doing your laundry and you have whites and you have clothes with color in them, and you separate the whites from the colored clothes, then you are actually kadoshing. You are separating, setting them apart. That's what kadosh really means. You can set apart things unto God. You can also set apart things unto Satan. You can set apart things unto an offering unto Adonai, and you can set apart things unto destruction. This is not something that's unusual, actually, but it is something that most people really don't think of and pay that close attention to. So what we have is the word, well, not the word. Where am I at? I got to make sure I'm staying where I'm at. Oh, yes. The Ha'atat is not offered up to Yahweh. The Ha'atat is set apart for destruction. And the reason why it's set apart for destruction is because it actually absorbs the poison. It's like that sponge that absorbs all of the wickedness involved, all of the poison that's involved with sin, all of the negative aspect that God wants removed from his presence. It's absorbed by the offering. When the laying on of hands and the transference of guilt takes place, then that offering absorbs that. And the result is, when you're talking about the high priest, it is such a powerful poison that it must be destroyed. And when you're talking, of course, about any of the Ha'atat offerings, the same rule applies. It's such a powerful poison, and it's so invasive that it needs to absolutely be destroyed. We use the words, let's see, yesterday, or no, not yesterday, last Thursday, I keep forgetting. Time's going by so quickly here for me. We used the word saraf in the Ha'atat last time, and the Ha'atat is not offered up to Yahweh, like I said. It is saraf, meaning that which is destroyed, and it is completely destroyed. If you remember, the animal was set apart for destruction. Well, if you stop and think, so wasn't Yeshua set apart for destruction? It was the Father that laid the sins of the world upon him, if you will. And when he absorbed all of that, he had to be destroyed in order to remove that from the sanctuaries that God was going to establish. And so he did. So we go on here, and I'm trying to make sure I don't skip over anything here, because there's a lot of stuff here that's very important. In Numbers 19, 17, and 18, we read these words, "For the unclean person, they are to take some of the ashes of the animal burned up as a purification from sin, and add them to fresh water in a container. A clean person is to take a bunch of hyssop leaves, dip it in the water, and sprinkle it on the tent and on all the containers, on the people who were there, and on the person who touched the bone, or the person killed, or the one who died naturally, or the grave." Again, kadosh means set apart, and something can be set apart, like I said, for holiness, or it can be set apart for common use. The word quatar was referring to the fire that was going on the brazen altar, and the things that were offered there were offered up to the Lord, and it was a pleasing aroma to him. But things that were burned on a common fire outside of the camp, for example, those things would have all been seraph, and they were completely to be destroyed because they were so polluted and defiled with the poison of sin and all of that that goes with it. So one thing we've learned about the Lord is that the holiness of the Lord, on one hand, is like dealing with nuclear radiation that's so dangerously contagious, it can infect anybody who comes near. Well, the red heifer sacrifice is kind of like that. It had soaked up so much of the impurity from others that anyone who approaches it become absolutely quickly and thoroughly unclean. When one performs the red heifer sacrifice or any ha'atat sacrifice, it does not benefit or atone for the person performing the ritual. It's not a benefit for the person performing the ritual. Not a benefit at all. Now, that's an interesting thing to keep in mind. When Yeshua went through with this, and it's modeled absolutely after the ha'atat, it was not to his benefit to do this. Not at all. He absorbed and he was destroyed. It's to our benefit when what he has accomplished is applied to us. And that's exactly how the ha'atat offering, the purification offering, worked. So the purpose of the blood of the animal used in any ha'atat sacrifice is not to purify the worshiper or to atone for him. Sure, the blood of the animal performs a purifying function, but if you were to go back and read the text of Leviticus carefully, you would see that the blood of the animal is splashed on the altar and on the pieces of furniture, upon the incense altar, inside the sanctuary. His purpose was to purify the sanctuary, not atone for the one performing the sacrifice. The one who performs the ritual doesn't get purified, he actually becomes unclean. Now, as we are starting to see, if you will, the connection here with Yeshua, he really was a ha'atat offering, qualified for purifying of the office of the high priest, himself becoming a kodosh, set apart for destruction. He was considered unclean. He absorbed the sin, taking on, if you will, the sins of the world, and he was completely destroyed. His blood shed in the camp atoned for the camp. His blood shed outside the camp, released at the thrust of the spear by the soldier, atoned for those outside the camp, and the water that gushed forth provided for purification. His sacrifice did not benefit him. It provided for the cleansing of the temple so that the Holy Spirit could occupy the temple. Now, we must remember what has transpired with Yeshua. He has prepared a place for God to occupy. And where God occupies today is your body and my body. It only is fit for occupation after salvation and after the blood is applied to us and we have received the benefit of Yeshua's sacrifice on our behalf. His ha'atat sacrifice has purified this temple, and the Holy Spirit comes to reside within us. It's our responsibility to make sure that the temple doesn't get defiled. That's what you and I are supposed to be doing. Now, when you talk about being uh, cut off, it's because if we let the temple be defiled and we do not repent, we do not seek forgiveness, we do not do anything in regards to uh, purifying the temple, we have a major problem, because God said these were people in Israel, by the way. And I'll say this: I know not everybody believes this way, but I think there's a lot of evidence that can support it. Israel was saved. God had saved them out of Egypt. By the time they get this information that's here in Leviticus and in Numbers, they are a saved nation. And so God gave them instructions as to what was required. And he said, if you allow yourself to be defiled, you can be cut off. Meaning, what we would think of as being cut off is losing our salvation. Well, is that what is being said? I'll let you decide. I don't want to argue the point. We all can look at it and we can begin to understand it as we learn what God has taught and we understand what Yeshua has done in light of the Torah, not in light of Christian teaching or denominational doctrine, but in light of what God has said, because that's what Yeshua went by, and that's what everybody once believed. Now, the Jewish community, at the destruction of the temple, has come up with all kinds of solutions to problems that can only be understood and dealt with through the transformation provision that Yeshua has provided for those that would receive him. The temple issues are resolved when you understand that God has established this body that you and I are in as a temple of his Spirit. It doesn't mean that it's never going to revert back to a physical temple. It will. But at that time, it will be utilized by God to accomplish his purpose. And I think the more we begin to realize and understand about the sacrifices that God has prescribed, we'll start to see exactly why that even is necessary. So now the difference in the red heifer ha'atat offering is no blood was applied to the brazen altar at all. Now, that's a very important thing to remember, because the red heifer offering was completely outside, where the high priest offering, the blood was applied to the brazen altar, and in different offerings that were required and laid out for us, the brazen altar was utilized, but not with the red heifer at all. So the red heifer's blood was shed outside the camp and sprinkled toward the temple. And Psalms 116:15 indicates that precious in his sight is the death of his faithful servants. Now, if you've ever held anybody that you loved in your arms and had them pass, that's a moment that's really hard to not only talk about, but to actually convey what really goes on in you through that process. And when I think of that, I think of that's how God views the death of his saints, the ones that have served him. It's precious in his sight. He never intended for us to die. And so with this death as a result of the sin, and it's required that we die if we're so permeated, with sin, and we haven't allowed the purification process and to take care of us? Well, people die apart from God. If we have received Yeshua, we still have to die, unfortunately, for our willful sins. That seems to be the only solution. The blessing we have in Yeshua, of course, is that through his resurrection, he's the first fruits of many brethren. And by what he's accomplished for us, we have the promise of eternal life and resurrection. So, it's an extraordinary thing. But in dealing here with this paradox, we find it is the mixture of the blood-infused ashes and the water that atones and purifies. So, as we look at this and we realize, well, the ashes are burnt, the red heifer is completely destroyed, the ashes are gathered up, mixed with water, and in that mixture, then we have a mixture that purifies. And it's one of those situations, if you will, a paradox that we're trying to figure out, well, how does this work? Well, it works not because the rabbis were able to figure it out, but because in hindsight, now we can look at it and we can see that actually it really points to Yeshua and how he fulfilled this paradox, if you will, of giving his life, which purifies and atones for men. And so we'll go on here. So we have a pretty good answer, and I guess it's probably time for that. Let me see, Roman numeral number 3. The focus of all Ha'atat offerings is the sanctity of the holy temple, the place where Yahweh dwells. Now, let me read this for you. It says, we have a good answer as to what's going on. If we, in light of the new covenant revelation, we can ask ourselves, what or who is now considered to be the tabernacle or temple of the living God? 1 Corinthians 3:16 tells us, don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? Romans 12:1, where it says, Paul writes, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. And 2 Corinthians 5:4, for we that are in the tabernacle do groan, in this tabernacle do groan, being burdened, not for that we would be unclothed, but clothed again, that mortality might be swallowed up of life. That's 2 Corinthians 5:4. The point here is, as we as believers are the living and breathing tabernacles or temples of God. We are alive with the Spirit of God within us. Now, Yeshua, as the mature 3-year-old bull, fulfilled the requirements of the sacrifice for the high priest. He was mature, and John 7:46 is an indication of that, when those that were sent out by the high priest to arrest him and to get him off the streets, basically, when they came back without him, they were asked, well, where is he? Why didn't you bring him? And their response was, no man speaks as this man. They recognized that Yeshua had a knowledge and a depth of knowledge, and his maturity was far beyond anything they'd ever heard, including the high priest that was basically their boss. In John 19:34, we read there, but one of the soldiers pierced Yeshua's side, and he's hanging on the cross at this time. He'd laid down his life. They pierced his side, and immediately blood and water came out. And what we need to see from this is that blood is the vehicle, if you will, that atones. It's the vehicle that atones. It's how atonement is done, and water purifies. So from Yeshua, all at once we have this gushing forth of both blood and water, which is exactly what the results of the red heifer sacrifice provided, is that there was atonement and there was purification. And the atonement was through the ashes. The blood of the heifer was burnt, turned to ashes, mixed with the water, and that concoction, that mixture provided for the healing. Is quite an interesting thing to think of, and realize that when Yeshua his side was pierced, that water and blood would come out at once, fulfilling exactly the requirements necessary for atoning, forgiveness, if you will, and purification. So what's purified? Those of us that are under the blood, we are atoned for. He took upon him the sins of the world, including my sins and your sins, both past, present, and future. And from his body came the purifying water. We find it represented in his word, of course. The water of the word purifies, and so on and so forth. Well, we have all of these things, and 1 John 1:7 says this to us. It says, "But if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Yeshua, his son, purifies us from all sin." We realize that the red heifer's water mixture and blood mixture, ash mixture, was physically sprinkled upon the people to provide for their restoration, their purification. Well, we can't literally take the physical blood and water that gush forth from Yeshua, but we can metaphorically receive it. And a metaphor, of course, is a figure of speech. It refers to one thing by mentioning a different subject. Parables, for example, are extended metaphors used to teach spiritual morals and truth. And so we receive these things. We say we receive them by faith, and that absolutely is true. We receive them by faith, but in the heavenly realm, they are an absolute reality. And our faith is supposed to be that as well, the reality that, yes, what God has said is absolutely true, and we can walk on it, live on it, and expect our future to be based on it. So in that light, we come, if you will, to this place in which we are at the close of our teaching, any aspect of it. I hope you all got the notes all right. Let me go ahead and